Medieval hygiene might shock you. People bathed maybe once a month, if they were wealthy. Chamber pots were emptied out windows into the streets. And that lovely medieval romance you've been reading? The nights probably smelled like sweat, rust, and old leather. Tonight, we're diving nose first into the pungent reality of daily life in the Middle Ages. You'll never look at a castle the same way again. That image of the knight in shining armor? Forget it. Most of the time, knights wore chainmail that reeked like a wet basement. The shining part didn't last long either, rust set in after the first rainstorm. That polished steel look from the movies? Try greasy iron with patches of reddish-brown corrosion instead. Armor wasn't just heavy, it was a full-time job. Rust never sleeps, and neither did the knights who had to scrub their gear constantly. Forget polishing a suit of armor once a week, this was daily maintenance just to keep it from falling apart. Squires spent hours oiling metal, patching broken rings, and chasing off rust spots before they could eat or sleep. Chainmail smelled worse than you think. Imagine wearing a metal sweater soaked with old sweat, rain, and whatever else leaked through your gambeson. The rings trapped moisture against your skin, making rust inevitable. Knights complained in letters about the stench, some even preferred fighting in lighter armor just to avoid it. The weight was no joke either. Full plate weighed 40 to 60 pounds, and chainmail wasn't much lighter. Chafing was constant. Under the armor, padded gambesons absorbed sweat but never dried properly. After a long march, knights peeled off layers to find rashes, blisters, and sores. No wonder some skipped armor entirely when they could get away with it. Iron and steel didn't hold up well in the field. Even high-quality armor developed weak spots after a few battles. Cheap armor rusted faster, sometimes flaking apart mid-fight. Knights with money hired armorers to fix dents, replace broken links, and re-rivet loose plates. Poorer knights had to do it themselves, badly. Speaking of armorers, their workshops were vital. These guys knew how to hammer out dents without weakening the metal, where to reinforce joints, and how to reline a helmet so it didn't give you a headache. A good armorer meant the difference between surviving a fight and getting a sword point through a rusted weak spot. The battlefield wasn't any easier. In summer, armor baked in the sun like a metal oven. In winter, it froze to skin. Rain turned the ground to mud, making every step exhausting. A knight knocked over in full plate could drown in a puddle if no one helped him up. Hollywood skips the part where half the battle is just struggling through terrain. Combat itself was brutal. Blunt force could dent armor enough to break bones underneath. Arrows found gaps. Swords and axes bent metal in wrong directions. After a skirmish, surviving knights spent days repairing damage, if they weren't too injured to lift a hammer. Tournaments weren't glamorous either. Jousting armor was even heavier than battle gear, and crashes left bruises through multiple layers of padding. Winners didn't ride off into the sunset, they limped to the medic tent with cracked ribs and dislocated shoulders. Knights weren't noble warriors most of the time. They were glorified bodyguards, tax collectors, and enforcers for whoever paid them. Battles were rare. More often, they spent weeks riding between villages, sleeping in fields, and trying to keep their gear from falling apart. The reality? Knights spent more time fighting rust than enemies. Their lives were a grind of maintenance, discomfort, and bad smells. The shine never lasted. Hollywood castles look cozy, don't they? Big fireplaces, clean stone floors, maybe a few tasteful tapestries. Reality was different. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Those thick stone walls kept enemies out, and cold, damp air in. Windows were small slits, more for shooting arrows than letting in light. Even in summer, the interior stayed chilly. In winter, breath fogged in the air as you walked through dim corridors. Sanitation didn't exist. Chamber pots got emptied out windows or into chutes that dumped waste into the moat, or just onto the ground below. The smell clung to everything. Imagine walking past a latrine chute on a hot day. Now imagine that smell seeping into your clothes, your bedding, your food. Servants tried to scrub floors with vinegar and herbs, but the stench never really left. Rats were everywhere. They chewed through grain sacks, left droppings in corners, and scurried across beds at night. Cats helped, but not enough. Some castles kept terriers to hunt vermin, but the rats always came back. Mice nested in straw mattresses. Fleas jumped from rushes strewn on the floor. You'd wake up with bites on your arms and neck, scratching until you bled. Bedrooms weren't private. Even nobles shared space with servants, guards, or visiting relatives. Curtains around beds provided the only separation. If you were lucky, you got a wooden bed frame with a straw mattress. Unlucky? You slept on a pallet on the floor. Sheets were rough linen, blankets heavy wool. In winter, you piled on furs and still shivered. Fireplaces smoked. Chimneys weren't efficient, so rooms filled with haze. Eyes stung. Clothes smelled like wood smoke for weeks. Servants spent hours hauling firewood, but the heat never reached far from the hearth. Halls stayed drafty, with cold air whistling through cracks in the stone. You'd wear layers indoors and still feel the chill in your bones. Food spoiled fast. Without refrigeration, meat got salted or smoked, if you could afford it. Poorer residents ate grain porridge with whatever vegetables hadn't rotted yet. Even in wealthy households, bread grew mold within days. Weevils infested flour sacks. You picked bugs out of your meal and ate anyway. Spices helped mask the taste of meat going bad, but not everyone could afford them. Water was a problem. Wells inside castle walls sometimes ran dry during sieges. Cisterns collected rainwater, but it tasted like wet stone. If the castle relied on a river, you drank whatever floated downstream, including waste from upstream villages. Ale was safer, but even that turned sour if stored too long. Light came from candles or oil lamps, but they guttered in drafts. After sunset, shadows swallowed most of the castle. Torches smoked and dripped hot wax. You carried a lantern if you walked the corridors at night, watching for rats darting across your path. Even the lord's chambers were dim, with maybe one or two expensive wax candles burning at a time. Noise never stopped. Servants clattered pots in the kitchen. Guards shouted on the walls. Dogs barked at nothing. At night, snores echoed through shared sleeping quarters. If you were near the stables, horses stamped and whinnied at odd hours. Stone amplified every sound, so arguments 3 rooms away kept you awake. Privacy didn't exist. Servants entered rooms without knocking. Guards stood outside doors, listening. Even private conversations got reported to the lord or lady. Courtyards bustled with people from dawn till dusk, blacksmiths hammering, merchants haggling, children shrieking during games. The only quiet places were the chapel or maybe a secluded garden, if the castle had one. Kings dealt with the same problems. Royal castles had more tapestries, maybe better furniture, but the rats didn't care. Henry VIII's palaces still had fleas in the rushes. Elizabeth I complained about drafts in her chambers. No amount of wealth could fix the basic flaws of medieval architecture. Castles weren't homes. They were fortresses, designed to withstand sieges, not provide comfort. Every luxury came second to defense. You lived with the cold, the smell, the vermin, because the alternative was letting enemies break down the gates. The romance of castle life? That's a modern invention. The reality was damp, noisy, and crawling with things you didn't want to think about. Think about those medieval banquet scenes in movies, roasted boars on silver platters, overflowing wine cups, mountains of fruit. That happened maybe once a year. If you were rich. For everyone else, meals were a daily exercise in hunger management. Forget fancy feasts. Most people lived on bread so coarse it could wear down your teeth, and stew so thin you could count the barley grains floating in it. Let's talk pottage first. This wasn't stew like you know it. It was a murky slop of whatever peasants could throw in a pot, dried peas, wilted cabbage, maybe a scrap of bacon if they were lucky. It simmered for hours, thickening into gluey mush. Some days it had flavor. Other days it tasted like wet dirt. You ate it with stale bread, using the crust to scrape every last bit from the bowl. That was lunch and dinner, every day, year after year. Bread was life, literally. If the harvest failed, people starved. Wheat grew poorly in bad years, so bakers mixed in ground-up acorns, sawdust, even clay to stretch the flour. The result? A dark, dense loaf that sat in your gut like a brick. Good bread had whole grains in it, but bad bread had rocks. Breaking a tooth wasn't rare. You chewed carefully. Meat? Forget it. Peasants rarely tasted fresh meat unless they poached it from the Lord's forest, a crime punishable by losing a hand. On special occasions, maybe a stringy chicken or a tough old rabbit made it into the pottage. Otherwise, it was salted fish, if you lived near water, or nothing at all. The rich ate meat daily, of course. They roasted whole pigs and let the fat drip into pans below, while peasants licked their lips from a distance. Famine wasn't a disaster, it was routine. Every few years, crops withered. Rain came too late or not at all. Grain stores ran low by spring. That's when people ate bark bread, flour mixed with tree pulp. It stopped the stomach pains, but not the weakness. Children's bellies swelled from malnutrition. Elders faded first. Starving families boiled leather belts for broth. Historical records mention the hungry gap between winter and harvest, a months-long stretch where entire villages hovered near death. Spices existed. Just not for you. Peppers and cinnamon traveled thousands of miles to flavor noble feasts, while peasants seasoned food with weeds, nettles, garlic mustard, anything green they could pick. Salt cost money, so it was used sparingly. Vinegar helped mask the taste of meat gone slightly off. Spoiled food wasn't thrown out. You held your nose and ate it anyway. Dairy was a rare bright spot. Cows and goats gave milk when they could, though yields dropped in winter. Cheese kept longer, so peasants pressed every drop into rounds that aged in cool cellars. Butter was precious, a thumb-sized lump might flavor a week's worth of pottage. Poor families traded eggs for nails or cloth because chickens were one of the few things they owned outright. Drinks were simpler. Water often made you sick, so even children drank weak ale, not the good kind, just fermented grain water with barely a buzz. Cider existed where apples grew, but most peasants never tasted wine. That was for the Lord's table, along with honeyed mead and spiced hippocras. Your cup held the same murky ale, morning and night, slightly sour from sitting in a wooden cask too long. Storage was a nightmare. Mice got into grain sacks. Flour weevils hatched in warm months. Meat spoiled unless salted into leathery strips. Root cellars helped, but a damp season could rot potatoes and turnips into mush. Smoke preserved fish and pork, but the taste lingered for months, every bite reminded you of last winter's desperation. The rich didn't just eat better, they flaunted it. A noble feast might feature roasted swan with the feathers reattached, or a pie full of live birds that flew out when cut. Jellied meats wobbled in intricate molds while musicians played. Meanwhile, peasants outside the castle walls gnawed on barley crusts. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant fresh greens, if you found them before anyone else. Summer brought berries, though many were sour or poisonous. Autumn was harvest time, the only period of full bellies. Winter was survival. You slaughtered animals you couldn't feed through the cold, salted the meat, and hoped it lasted until thaw. Cookbooks existed, for nobles. They listed recipes involving saffron, almond milk, and sugar, which might as well have been gold dust to peasants. Your cookbook was your mother showing you how to stir a pot of gruel without burning it. Measurements didn't exist. You threw in what you had and endured the results. Food wasn't just scarce, it was dangerous. Moldy rye caused convulsions and hallucinations. Ergot poisoning turned whole villages mad. Undercooked beans released toxins. Yet people ate risky foods because the alternative was starving. You took your chances with every bite. Feast days were brief reprieves. Christmas might mean an actual meat pie, Easter a few hard-boiled eggs. But tomorrow it was back to dark bread and thin pottage, watching the Lord's wagons haul grain past your starving children. Most medieval lives were measured in empty bowls and the hope that next harvest would be better. It usually wasn't. The Black Death gets all the attention, but it was just one of many ways medieval people died young. A simple cut could kill you if it got infected. A bad cold might turn into pneumonia overnight. Childbirth was Russian roulette for mothers. Disease wasn't some rare catastrophe, it was background noise in everyday life. Doctors had no idea what caused sickness. They blamed bad air, angry gods, or imbalances in bodily fluids called humors. Their cures often made things worse. For fever, they drained your blood to restore balance. For headaches, they might drill holes in your skull. If you were lucky, the treatment just wasted your money. If not, it finished what the disease started. Hospitals were places you went to die, not get better. Monks might pray over you while you lay in an overcrowded hall with other dying patients. Fresh air, clean sheets, sterile tools. No such concepts existed. The floor would be strewn with soiled rushes crawling with lice. Your sickbed neighbor might be coughing up plague symptoms while a physician bled someone screaming in pain nearby. Child mortality rates would shock modern parents. Half of all kids died before age 5. Mothers expected to bury at least some of their children. A fever could take a healthy toddler in 2 days. Summer diarrhea epidemics wiped out whole cohorts of village kids every year. Parents named multiple children the same name, expecting some wouldn't survive. The Black Death was different only in scale. When it hit in 1347, villages lost 2/3 of their people in months. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. But plagues weren't unusual, just usually less deadly. Smallpox scars marked most adult faces. Measles killed weakened children regularly. Every few years, some new sickness swept through town. You couldn't escape illness because you couldn't escape filth. Streets ran with human waste that contaminated water supplies. Fleas in your bedding carried disease. Flies swarmed over food in markets. Bathing was rare, so skin infections spread through households. Even the wealthy lived in conditions we'd consider unsanitary today. Malnutrition made everything worse. Weak bodies couldn't fight infections. After poor harvests, starvation and disease worked together to thin populations. Kids with swollen bellies from hunger died first when sickness came. Elders faded quickly without proper nutrition. Whole families might perish in a bad winter, taken by wasting sickness that was really just hunger opening the door to infection. People developed a grim acceptance of death. You knew you'd probably die by 40 if you made it past childhood. Wills were written young. Mothers steeled themselves against losing babies. When the priest came to perform last rites for your neighbor, you knew your turn might come soon. Surviving childhood diseases didn't mean safety, just a delay of the inevitable next threat. Medical texts from the period read like horror stories today. One recommended cure for plague involved rubbing a live chicken against the sick person's buboes until the bird died. Another suggested drinking powdered emeralds. Some physicians diagnosed illnesses by tasting the patient's urine. Their theories were equal parts superstition and bad guesses. The wealthy didn't fare much better. Kings died from infected cuts suffered in battle. Queens succumbed in childbirth. Rich merchants wasted away from dysentery caught at a feast. Money could buy you piles of herbs and expensive treatments, but none actually worked. A lord might get a private room when sick, but the air was just as foul, the treatments just as dangerous. Cities were death traps. Crowded streets, shared wells, and constant population turnover made urban areas breeding grounds for disease. Towns routinely lost 1/3 of their people during outbreaks. Yet survivors stayed because where else could they go? Countryside villages fared little better when traveling laborers or merchants brought sickness with them. People tried whatever they could to avoid illness. They carried foul-smelling herbs to ward off bad air. They prayed to saints specialized in particular diseases. They wore charms containing relics of the dead. None of it helped, but when your choices are false hope or despair, you reach for anything. After plagues passed, life went on. Survivors remarried quickly because farms needed workers. Orphans were taken in, and put to work, by relatives. Empty villages were repopulated by land-hungry neighbors. People grieved, then carried on, because what else could they do? The next crisis was always coming, whether from disease, famine, or war. We think of medicine as progressing slowly. In truth, for centuries it didn't progress at all. Each generation died the same way their ancestors had, in the same numbers, from the same causes. Their only progress was developing calluses against the constant presence of death. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of plagues, they were one long plague with occasional periods of slightly less dying. Think modern justice is harsh. Medieval law didn't bother with fines or community service. Punishment was quick, public, and designed to make you regret being born. A thief didn't get probation, he lost a hand. A liar might have his tongue cut out. And that's if the judge felt generous that morning. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were entertainment. Towns gathered to watch hangings, beheadings, burnings. The more creative the method, the bigger the crowd. Some executions dragged out for hours. One technique involved hanging a criminal just enough to strangle him slowly, then cutting him down to revive him, only to hang him again. Another favorite? The breaking wheel, where limbs were systematically shattered with an iron bar while the crowd cheered. Trial by ordeal sounded fair until you saw it in action. Accused of theft. Walk 9 feet carrying a red-hot iron bar. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, God declared you innocent. If not, you were guilty, and already half dead from infection. Suspected of witchcraft. They tied your hands and feet and threw you in a pond. If you floated, and therefore drowned, you were innocent. If you sank, you were guilty, and already dead. Either way, you lost. The law favored spectacle over fairness. A nobleman might get a quick beheading with a sharp sword, but peasants faced drawn-out suffering. Female criminals often burned at the stake because it was considered more dignified than hanging, as if being roasted alive had dignity. Some towns used specially designed execution devices, like the Spanish donkey, a triangular wooden wedge you straddled while weights were tied to your feet until you split in half. Torture wasn't just for punishment, it was standard procedure for confessions. The rack stretched joints until they popped. The Judas cradle lowered you onto a pointed pyramid until it split you open. Thumbscrews crushed fingers bone by bone. None of these tools determined guilt, they just ensured everyone confessed to something eventually. Truth didn't matter. The point was getting screams loud enough to scare bystanders. Church courts had their own special horrors. Accused of heresy. You might face the pair of anguish, a metal device inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina and expanded with a screw until it tore tissue. Blasphemy could mean having your tongue nailed to a post before it was cut out. Even minor sins brought public floggings where priests counted lashes like rosary beads. Punishments fit crimes in twisted ways. Poisoners were boiled alive. Counterfeiters got molten metal poured down their throats. Perjury meant branding the liar's forehead. Animal thieves were sewn into the skins of dead beasts and thrown to dogs. The message wasn't subtle: break the rules, and you'll suffer in ways people will talk about for decades. Some punishments lasted longer than death. Bodies of executed criminals often stayed on display for weeks. Heads were mounted on spikes above city gates. Quartered traitors had limbs sent to different towns as warnings. Rotting corpses swung from gallows until the ropes decayed, a daily reminder of what happened to troublemakers. Wealth offered little protection. Noblemen accused of treason faced brutal deaths, hung, drawn, and quartered if the king wanted to make an example. Richard II's conspirators had their intestines wound out onto spools before being burned in front of them. Even royal family members weren't safe. Edward II died when his executioners shoved a red-hot poker up his bowels to leave no visible marks. Women suffered extra layers of cruelty. Adulteresses were paraded naked through town before being flogged. Prostitutes might have their noses cut off. A woman who murdered her husband could be burned alive, the same crime by a man against his wife. Just a regular hanging. Gossips faced scolds' bridles, iron masks with tongue spikes that made speech agony. Children weren't spared either. A 12-year-old could hang for stealing bread. Young pickpockets had their ears nailed to posts before being forced to tear free. Some towns used branks, metal cages placed over children's heads with spikes pointing inward, as punishment for disobedience. Parenting manuals recommended beating kids with rods until blood flows to prevent future crimes. Justice didn't care about proof. Anonymous accusations could land you in a dungeon. Local lords decided verdicts based on rumors. Witnesses were tortured until they said what prosecutors wanted. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Prisons were just waiting rooms for torture chambers or execution grounds. The real purpose of medieval justice wasn't fairness, it was fear. Every public mutilation, every screaming heretic burning at the stake, every decomposing body on the city wall taught the same lesson: obey, or suffer in ways no human should endure. Trials weren't about truth. Punishments weren't about justice. The whole system was designed to make sure no one dared challenge the people in power, because they could do far worse to you than you could ever imagine. Hollywood shows medieval wars as constant sword clashes and heroic charges. Reality was different. Armies spent most of their time marching through mud, sitting outside castle walls, or starving in makeshift camps. Battlefields saw action maybe once or twice a season. The rest was waiting, suffering, and counting the days until you could go home. Sieges defined medieval warfare more than battles. Picture this: you surround an enemy castle with a few thousand men. Now you wait. Weeks pass. Your job isn't fighting, it's building siege engines, digging trenches, and praying dysentery doesn't wipe out your camp first. Castles were designed to outlast attackers. Their storerooms held months of supplies while your army foraged in picked-over countryside. You ate moldy grain or nothing at all. Meanwhile, defenders threw rotting carcasses over the walls to spread disease among your ranks. Supply lines barely existed. Armies traveled with wagon trains of food, but these ran low fast. Local villages got stripped clean within days. Soldiers stole chickens, pillaged grain stores, and killed livestock, anything to avoid starvation. When supplies ran out, you ate your horses. Then you ate leather straps. Then you ate nothing. Historical records mention armies dissolving mid-campaign because men wandered off to find food. Desertion wasn't treason, it was survival. Disease killed more soldiers than swords. Camps bred sickness faster than battles bred heroes. Open latrines contaminated water sources. Fleas in bedding spread typhus. Close quarters passed respiratory infections like wildfire. A minor wound turned septic with no clean bandages. Healthy men collapsed with fever overnight. Commanders expected to lose a third of their force to illness before facing the enemy. The lucky ones got sent home. The rest died coughing in mud. Weather decided battles more than tactics. Autumn rains turned roads to bogs, stranding supply wagons. Summer heat baked men in armor. Winter froze fingers to sword hilts. Chroniclers wrote about entire campaigns ruined by early snows or unseasonal downpours. An army that marched too late in the year might find itself starving in frozen fields without enough forage for horses. Nature didn't care about your king's ambitions. Pay was irregular when it came at all. Most soldiers fought for wages, not loyalty. When lords ran out of coin, armies mutinied. Records show mercenary companies switching sides mid-siege because someone offered better pay. Professional soldiers demanded bonuses for storming walls or holding difficult positions. If the money stopped, so did the fighting. Some captains kept their men in line by letting them pillage conquered towns, a risky move that turned locals against you. Boredom was a constant enemy. Days passed with no movement from the besieged castle. Soldiers gambled, fought each other, or got drunk on stolen wine. Sentries dozed at their posts. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among restless men who'd signed up for glory but got monotony instead. Siege chronicles mention more deaths from brawls than combat during quiet stretches. Logistics broke armies faster than battles. A single warhorse needed 20 pounds of fodder daily, impossible to supply in winter. Armor required smiths and leatherworkers to maintain it on campaign. Arrows ran low after a few skirmishes. Soldiers wore through boots marching miles of muddy roads. Most medieval warfare amounted to complex math. Could you feed your men longer than the enemy could hold out? The answer usually decided wars before any heroic last stands. Waiting wore down even veterans. Seasonal soldiers, farmers called up for summer campaigns, grew restless as harvest time approached. Professional troops lost morale during endless sieges. Letters home begged for news of family or money to buy food. Some men faked injuries to get dismissed. Others simply walked away into the night. Commanders posted guards not just to watch for enemies, but to stop their own men from deserting. When battles finally happened, they were chaotic and brief. Hollywood shows hours of choreographed swordplay. Real medieval battles often ended in under an hour. Once lines broke, it became a slaughter of fleeing men. Survivors remembered the noise, metal clashing, horses screaming, wounded men calling for help that never came. Then it was over, and you went back to waiting for the next miserable march somewhere else. Aftermaths were worse than the fighting. Wounded men died slowly in filthy field hospitals. Plague spread through camps crowded with exhausted survivors. Victors celebrated by looting enemy corpses, searching for coins, weapons, anything valuable. Losers who surrendered faced ransom demands or execution. Either way, you traded the brief terror of battle for the drawn-out suffering of consequences. Warfare wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. The best commanders weren't brilliant tacticians, but good accountants who could feed troops and replace losses. Winning meant outlasting the other side through hunger, disease, and boredom. Most medieval soldiers died with no heroic last words, just quietly succumbing to infection in some muddy field hospital. Their greatest battle wasn't against enemies, but against the relentless grind of simply staying alive until the war ended. The church preached poverty and humility, but many clergy lived like princes. Bishops wore robes worth a peasant's lifetime wages. Monasteries stockpiled gold while beggars starved at their gates. This wasn't a few bad apples, corruption was built into the system. Positions were sold to the highest bidder. Relatives of powerful clergy got cushy jobs without qualifications. The gap between Sunday sermons and Monday behavior was wide enough to ride a warhorse through. Indulgences were the medieval equivalent of pay to win. Want to skip purgatory? The church sold tickets. For the right price, you could buy forgiveness for future sins you hadn't even committed yet. It was spiritual insurance with no claims adjuster. Some pardonas traveled with stacks of pre-signed blank indulgence certificates, ready to fill in your name after taking your coins. The more you paid, the more sins got erased, leading to jokes about rich men buying their way into heaven while beggars watched from hell. Clergy sexual misconduct wasn't whispered about, it was common knowledge. Priests kept concubines openly in some regions. Bishops fathered children without shame. One 15th-century cardinal had 9 illegitimate kids and got them all church jobs. Parishioners knew, but complaining risked excommunication. Church courts handled clergy crimes, and guess what? They tended to go easy on their own. A priest who raped might get transferred. A layman who stole bread lost a hand. Monasteries weren't always holy retreats. Some became drinking clubs for noblemen's younger sons. Monks got fat on donated feasts while breaking their vows of poverty. Visitors reported finding dice games in cloisters and wine cellars better stocked than prayer books. Not all were like this, some monasteries kept true to their ideals, but enough caused scandals that people joked about monks who couldn't remember the last time they prayed. The higher you looked in the church hierarchy, the worse it got. Popes waged wars like kings. The 10th century saw popes deposed for murder, adultery, and selling the papacy to the highest bidder. One pope put his predecessor's corpse on trial. Another allegedly fathered a child with his daughter. The Vatican became a nest of political scheming where spiritual concerns took backseat to power plays. Ordinary people noticed the hypocrisy. Ballads circulated about greedy friars and lustful priests. Peasants muttered that churchmen preached water but drank wine. Some stopped going to confession, knowing the priest might be worse than they were. Many still believed in God, just not necessarily in his earthly representatives. Superstition filled gaps the church left open. People carried rabbits' feet to Massachusetts. They nailed horseshoes over church doors for luck. Old pagan sites got Christian names but kept their magical reputations. A farmer might pray to St. Anthony for lost livestock one day and whisper charms over his field the next. The church called this heresy, but couldn't stamp it out. Relics became big business. Every church needed a saint's bone or holy artifact to draw pilgrims. Enterprising monks discovered new relics whenever funds ran low. One abbey claimed to have John the Baptist's head, while 2 others made the same claim. Pieces of the true cross multiplied until, as one critic noted, there was enough wood to build a ship. Didn't matter, people kept coming, kept donating. The Inquisition wasn't just about heresy, it was a money-maker. Confiscated property went straight to church coffers. Witnesses learned that accusing wealthy neighbors could pay off. Some inquisitors became rich from bribes to look the other way. Torture produced confessions on demand. The system wasn't designed to find truth, it was designed to keep feeding itself. Yet people kept faith alive in their own ways. They attended Mass not for the sermon, but for the Eucharist, the one holy thing they still trusted. They prayed directly to saints, bypassing corrupt priests. Household shrines outnumbered church donations in many homes. The church's failure to practice what it preached didn't kill belief, just redirected it. Sunday sermons warned about hellfire, but everyone knew which local lord had paid the bishop for a divorce. Bible stories about rich men struggling to enter heaven got awkward when the priest telling them rode a finer horse than the baron. People nodded along while thinking private thoughts. They took what comfort they could from religion and rolled their eyes at the rest. By the late Middle Ages, frustration boiled over. Reformers like Wycliffe and Huss called out church corruption. Ordinary folks flocked to movements that promised purity. The stage was set for Luther's revolution, but that's another story. What matters is seeing the medieval church as it was, less a shining city on a hill than a leaky raft manned by hustlers, with the faithful bailing water to keep it afloat. The church held a monopoly on salvation, and like all monopolists, it got lazy. Prices rose while quality fell. Customers grumbled but kept buying because they had no other suppliers. Until one day, they did. The Reformation didn't come from nowhere, it grew from centuries of people seeing the robe and smelling the rot beneath. Serfs weren't slaves. That's the first thing to get straight. They couldn't be sold like property, and they couldn't be kicked off their land without cause. Instead, they were tied to it through a web of rights and obligations spelled out in manorial court records. These documents show peasants weren't helpless victims, they had legal protections, however limited. Manorial courts weren't just tools of oppression. They also served as dispute resolution centers where peasants could argue their cases. Got a neighbor stealing your firewood? The court might fine him. Think your lord is demanding too much labor? You could challenge it. The system wasn't fair by modern standards, lords usually had the upper hand, but it wasn't lawless either. Custom dictated what lords could and couldn't do, and peasants used that to push back. Take labor duties. A serf might owe 3 days a week working the lord's fields, but the record specified exactly which days and which tasks. Lords couldn't suddenly demand extra work during harvest unless it was already agreed upon. Some serfs negotiated better terms by paying cash instead of labor. Others specialized, maybe you were the village blacksmith, so your work was repairing tools instead of plowing fields. Land rights mattered most. Peasants didn't own their plots outright, but they held hereditary rights to farm them. As long as they met obligations, they could pass the land to their kids. Lords needed a valid reason to take it away, not paying rents, failing to work required days, or letting fields go fallow. Even then, the process went through the manorial court, not the lord's whim. Women had more rights than you'd expect. Widows often kept their husband's land for life, provided they didn't remarry outside the manor. Daughters inherited if there were no sons. Some women ran breweries or traded at markets. Court records show them suing neighbors over property lines or debts, and sometimes winning. They weren't equals to men, but they weren't property either. Community enforcement kept lords in check. If a noble tried raising rents beyond custom, entire villages might refuse together. There's strength in numbers, one peasant complaining gets whipped, 50 withholding labor forces negotiation. Some manors had elected juries of peasants to help judge cases. Others let villagers appoint constables to police the lord's rules. Peasant revolts proved they weren't passive. The 1381 English uprising targeted tax collectors and burned manor records, the documents that bound them to feudal duties. In Germany, the Bundschuh movement demanded an end to serfdom decades before Luther. Most failed spectacularly, rebels got hanged in creative ways, but they shook the system enough that lords sometimes backed off new demands. The difference between free peasants and serfs mattered. Free tenants paid cash rent and could leave the manor if they wanted. Serfs needed the lord's permission to marry off the manor or sell livestock. But even serfs could accumulate wealth, some owned multiple cattle, better tools, or leased extra land. The poorest were often free laborers with no land at all, proving that freedom didn't always mean prosperity. Inheritance laws reveal clever workarounds. Parents might leave a daughter her best dress and bed, while the son got the land, but the dress's pockets contained enough coins to buy her own plot later. Some wills specified that land should pass to whichever child cared for the parents in old age, not just the eldest son. Peasants played the system where they could. Market days offered loopholes. Many manors let serfs sell surplus crops at town markets and keep the profits. Over years, a shrewd peasant might save enough to buy his freedom, or bribe the manor clerk to lose his serfdom records. Urban areas became refuges. Live in a town undetected for a year and a day, and you were legally free. Lords hated this and sometimes sent posses to drag escapees back. The church provided another escape hatch. Enter a monastery, and your serf status vanished, though lords often demanded compensation. One 14th-century abbot paid a nobleman 20 shillings to release a peasant who became a monk. Younger sons of serfs joined holy orders just to get educated and escape field labor. Death duties show the system's grip. When a serf died, the lord typically took the best beast as inheritance tax. Families sometimes hid their best cow when death neared, presenting the second best instead. Court records list cases where lords accused heirs of cheating them out of a prize ox or horse. Customs varied wildly by region. In some French villages, serfs gathered yearly to re-elect their lord, mostly ceremonial, but it implied he ruled by their consent. Certain German manors let peasants appeal to the emperor if the local noble oppressed them. Eastern Europe was generally harsher, with nobles gaining near absolute power over serfs by the late Middle Ages. The Black Death shifted power. With half Europe dead, surviving peasants could demand better terms. Many lords switched from forced labor to cash rents, since desperate landowners competed for workers. Wages rose despite laws trying to cap them. Some serfs found they could simply walk to the next county and name their price. By 1500, serfdom was crumbling in the West. But it wasn't because lords grew kind. Peasants kept pushing, finding cracks in the system, and slowly bending custom in their favor. They endured hunger, exploitation, and backbreaking labor, but they weren't passive. Those manorial records prove it. Scribbled in margins are notes of small victories: a rent reduced, a boundary secured, a son's freedom bought. Not liberty as we know it, but inches gained against a system designed to keep them down. Want to time travel to a medieval city? You wouldn't last till lunch. Those picturesque cobblestone streets you're imagining? More like open sewers with stepping stones. Every morning, housewives tossed chamber pot contents out windows with a shout of "Gardez-vous." Medieval 4, look out below. If you didn't get splashed, you still walked through it. Streets sloped toward central gutters where garbage and waste festered until rain washed it away, or until the smell got bad enough that someone ordered a cleanup. Dead animals rotted where they fell. Stray dogs gnawed at carcasses. Rats scurried through piles of fish guts tossed by market sellers. In summer, flies swarmed so thick you breathed them in. In winter, frozen waste piled up until the thaw turned streets into rivers of filth. Cities smelled worse than you can imagine, a mix of human waste, rancid meat, and the tannery's vats of urine used for curing leather. Your eyes would water within minutes. Building regulations barely existed. Houses leaned into streets at precarious angles, upper floors jutting out to block sunlight. Narrow alleys turned pitch black at night, perfect for ambushes. Wooden buildings packed tight meant fires spread fast. London burned 6 times between 1077 and 1135 before anyone required brick chimneys. Even then, straw roofs and plaster walls made every neighborhood a tinderbox. You'd wake to screams and church bells clanging as flames jumped from house to house with no fire brigade to stop it. Workplace accidents happened daily. Construction workers fell from cathedral scaffolds. Medieval safety harnesses didn't exist. Butchers slipped while slaughtering livestock in severed arteries. Blacksmiths got third-degree burns from splashing molten metal. Apprentices lost fingers to loom shuttles or grindstones. Guild records list payments to widows whose husbands died by misadventure at work. No workers' compensation, just condolences and maybe a small pension if the guild liked you. Traffic was deadly. Cartwheels crushed drunkards who passed out in streets. Spooked horses trampled children chasing balls. Wagons carrying stone blocks snapped axles and crushed bystanders. At night, you risked falling into open cesspits or construction trenches. Moonlight didn't penetrate those overhanging buildings, so you walked with a lantern, which also made you a target for thieves. Water wasn't safe to drink. Public wells drew from groundwater contaminated by latrines and graves. Ale was safer, but even brewers used polluted river water. Cholera outbreaks killed hundreds in days. Typhoid fever spread through food washed in dirty water. Dysentery, called the bloody flux, emptied whole neighborhoods as people fled or died. Even your home tried to kill you. Stairs were uneven and unlit. Floors rotted under damp rushes. Loft beds collapsed, crushing sleepers below. Children tumbled into hearth fires. Roaches and bedbugs infested straw mattresses. Flea bites led to infected scratches. Smoke from poorly ventilated hearths caused lung diseases. Night brought different dangers. Watchmen patrolled main streets but avoided alleys where gangs waited. Wealthy men hired torchbearers for protection. Poorer folks traveled in groups. If attacked, you screamed for the hue and cry, but by the time neighbors woke up, your purse was gone. Some cities had curfews, but drunks still wandered into dark corners never seen again. Market squares hosted public executions, not just for justice, but to remind everyone what happened to troublemakers. Heads on spikes decorated city gates. Gibbets hung rotting corpses where roads entered town. Prisoners awaiting trial died of disease in crowded jails. Public whippings and brandings drew cheering crowds. Yet people kept coming to cities. Countryside famines sent peasants seeking food. Younger sons left farms for apprenticeships. Artisans followed work. However miserable city life was, it offered chances villages didn't: work, marriage prospects, anonymity if you needed it. Survivors grew tough. They learned which wells were cleanest, which markets sold freshest food, which streets to avoid after dark. City ordinances tried to control the chaos. Some laws required householders to sweep their street frontage weekly. Others forbade dumping waste after dark. But enforcement depended on corruptible officials. Fines for sanitation violations often went unpaid. Wealthy citizens bribed their way out of trouble while the poor suffered consequences. Urbanites died younger than peasants but lived better while they lasted. Markets offered meat year-round. Taverns provided entertainment unavailable in villages. Churches staged mystery plays. Street performers juggled knives or danced bears. Festivals broke winter monotony. Just don't drink the water. Or breathe too deep. Or stay out after dark. Or walk under construction sites. Or, you get the idea. Visiting medieval cities sounds romantic until you realize they were death traps disguised as civilization. The idea that children deserve special protection and care is surprisingly modern. Medieval kids didn't get childhoods, they got chores. By age 5, you'd be expected to work. Toddlers gathered firewood. 7-year-olds tended animals. 12-year-old apprentices worked the same hours as grown men. There was no concept of age-appropriate tasks, just hands small enough to reach into chicken coops or thread looms. Kids married young. Noble girls often wed at 12, sometimes younger. Records show peasant marriages with brides as young as 9. These weren't symbolic: a married 12-year-old managed households, cooked meals, and bore children. The church set the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls, 14 for boys, but local lords often ignored it. When parents died, surviving children might marry immediately to secure property rights. Romance didn't factor in. Education was for the lucky few. Maybe one village boy in 50 got schooling, usually to train as a priest. Girls only learned if their families could afford private tutors, and even then, just enough to read prayer books. Most kids learned through labor. Farmers' sons worked fields alongside fathers. Craftsmen's children swept workshops before handling tools. Knowledge passed through doing, not books. Illiteracy wasn't shameful, it was normal. Child mortality shaped everything. About half of kids died before age 5. Parents named multiple children the same name, expecting some wouldn't survive. Grief was common but brief: you mourned, then focused on living children. Wet nurses took in extra babies when mothers died in childbirth. Orphaned kids became servants in relatives' homes. Emotional attachment wasn't absent, but tempered by harsh math: love too much, and you'd likely lose them. Clothes showed how society viewed children. They wore miniature adult outfits, no special children's fashions. Swaddled infants graduated to small tunics. Shoes were rare until kids worked regularly. Portraits show solemn children posed like adults, their faces already marked by responsibility. Toys existed, but were simple: carved wooden dolls, leather balls, sticks as pretend swords. Play happened between chores, if at all. Work started at dawn. Peasant kids rose with parents to milk cows or collect eggs. Craft apprentices slept in workshop lofts, woken by masters to light fires. Even noble children had duties: practicing horsemanship, memorizing prayers, learning court manners. Idle hands meant wasted labor, and every family needed all hands working. City laws fined parents whose kids loitered instead of working. Discipline was harsh. Records describe children beaten with rods until blood flows. Church sermons urged strict correction. One parenting manual advised breaking a child's will early. Apprenticeship contracts permitted reasonable physical punishment, which masters interpreted loosely. Runaway apprentice notices describe branded faces and missing fingers as identification marks. The line between discipline and abuse didn't exist. Child labor laws were centuries away. Mine owners prized small bodies for narrow tunnels. Textile workshops employed kids to crawl under looms, collecting dropped threads in damp, lint-filled air. Glassmakers used children to turn blowpipes: the heat blistered their hands. Some cities banned certain deadly trades for children, but enforcement was rare. An 8-year-old chimney sweep was just cheaper than an adult. Food rations treated kids as small adults. Monasteries recorded identical meals for everyone over 7, same thin ale, same hard bread. Work crews got equal portions regardless of age. Malnourished children worked beside better-fed adults, their growth stunted by years of heavy labor. Wealthier families might give extra milk to youngsters, but children's menus didn't exist. You ate what kept you working. Legal systems made no exceptions for age. 10-year-olds stood trial for theft. 12-year-olds could hang. Some courts showed mercy to children, but the law recognized only physical size, not maturity. A large 14-year-old might be tried as an adult, while a small 16-year-old got leniency. Witnesses as young as 7 testified in cases. Your voice counted if you were old enough to swear an oath. Holidays offered slight reprieves. May Day let kids dance around poles. Christmas might bring an extra egg in the porridge. But even festivals had work: gathering greens for decorations, helping prepare feasts, entertaining guests. Church processions included children, but as participants, not spectators. Every event reinforced their place in the social order: small, but still part of the machine. The modern concept of childhood would baffle medieval people. Playgrounds, school hours, age-based clothing, all nonsensical luxuries. Kids were workers first, children second. Loving your children didn't mean sheltering them, it meant preparing them for short, hard lives. Every scrap of food, every hour of labor mattered too much for sentimentality. Childhood as we know it wasn't forgotten in the Middle Ages. It hadn't been invented yet. High mortality rates made investment in children risky. Why educate a boy who might die in the next plague? Why dote on a daughter who'd marry away at 12? Survival required viewing kids as helpers, not treasures. The few surviving diaries that mention children show affection, but also acceptance of early death and labor. One father wrote proudly of his 7-year-old daughter spinning wool as well as any woman. That was the compliment then, not playful or bright, but useful. The shock isn't that medieval children worked hard. It's that we've convinced ourselves they shouldn't. Our modern bubble of protected childhoods lasts barely 150 years. Just a brief, strange exception in human history. For most of time, kids were just small adults with the same fears, pains, and duties. Maybe kinder, maybe crueler, definitely simpler. You worked until you died, and if you were small, you worked twice as hard to prove you belonged. Medieval doctors worked with a playbook of utterly wrong ideas. Their entire system revolved around the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood. They'd bleed you. Too much phlegm. They'd make you vomit. The logic sounded reasonable until you realized they had no actual proof any of this worked. It was all guesswork disguised as science, passed down from ancient Greek texts nobody dared question. The diagnostic methods would make modern doctors cringe. Physicians examined urine samples for color, smell, and even taste. They'd study the pulse while ignoring actual symptoms. Some claimed they could diagnose illness by which way a patient's urine spun when stirred. Medical texts contained elaborate charts matching urine colors to diseases, all complete nonsense. Patients didn't get better because of these methods, they got better despite them. Bloodletting was the go-to solution for everything. Headache? Bleed them. Fever? Bleed them more. Weakness from previous blood loss? Obviously they needed another bleeding. Leeches and crude lancets opened veins, often on the wrong body parts. Some practitioners bled patients from the ankle for headaches or the arm for foot pain. Records show people dying from blood loss while their doctors insisted they just needed one more bleeding to balance the humors. Surgery was butchery with extra steps. No anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium poppy extracts. No sterilization, surgeons wiped blades on their aprons between patients. Common procedures included trepanning, drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits, and amputations with a 50% mortality rate from infection. Surgeons often learned through trial and error on live patients. The most skilled could remove cataracts with a needle, but many left patients blind or dead from infection. Herbal remedies sometimes worked by accident. Willow bark tea relieved pain because it contained salicylic acid, aspirin's ancestor. But just as often, treatments made things worse. Wounds got packed with dung or honey that introduced infection. Arsenic and mercury were common ingredients. Doctors prescribed theriac, a mix of dozens of herbs and opium that cured nothing but made patients stop complaining. The Black Death revealed how clueless medicine really was. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, thinking bad smells caused disease. They advised avoiding baths, fearing water opened pores to infection. Some prescribed rubbing live chickens on plague boils. Others told people to breathe in sewer fumes to drive out the illness. Meanwhile, the actual cure, avoiding flea bites, never occurred to them. Hospitals were death sentences. Run by monasteries, these were places for prayer, not healing. Patients shared beds, spreading infections. The nurses were monks with no medical training. Treatment involved bleeding, enemas, and constant prayers. Healthy people who entered with minor ailments often died from infections caught inside. Records show many patients signing out early, preferring to take their chances at home. Childbirth was particularly deadly. Midwives had no concept of hygiene. They used unwashed hands and tools, spreading childbed fever. If delivery got complicated, they might crush the baby's skull to save the mother, or vice versa. About 1 in 5 mothers died in childbirth. Infant mortality was worse, half didn't reach age 5. Yet no one connected these deaths to the filthy practices causing them. Rich patients fared worst of all. They could afford the most elaborate treatments, which usually meant the most dangerous. Kings died from enforced bed rest that caused pneumonia, or from medicinal gold and crushed gemstones poisoning their systems. Poor peasants relying on folk remedies often did better, at least garlic and honey rarely killed anyone. Mental illness treatments were especially cruel. Depression meant you had too much black bile, so doctors prescribed purges and beatings to drive it out. Possessed, patients got exorcisms that included starvation and physical abuse. Some were locked in fools' towers, where visitors paid to gawk at them. The few genuine epileptics lucky enough to survive childhood often ended up chained in church basements. Doctors themselves were a mixed lot. University-trained physicians were expensive and rare, mostly serving nobles. Barber surgeons pulled teeth and set bones between haircuts. Apothecaries sold drugs they barely understood. Wandering quacksalvers peddled fake cures at fairs. The average village might have an old woman with some herbal knowledge, your best chance at actual treatment. People knew the system was broken. Medical satire was common, poems mocked arrogant doctors who could tell the illness from the pisspot, but not the cure. Patients frequently refused treatments, preferring to trust in saints or folk wisdom. Many wills included clauses forbidding physicians from touching their bodies after death, fearing unnecessary dissection. The truth? Most medieval medicine made patients worse, not better. The rare effective treatments worked despite the theories behind them, not because of them. Progress was nearly impossible when the medical establishment violently opposed new ideas. It took centuries before anyone questioned whether balancing invisible humors might be less effective than, say, washing their hands. For all their elaborate theories, medieval doctors succeeded mainly at one thing, proving how long humanity can cling to bad ideas. Their treatments weren't just ineffective, they actively harmed people while convincing everyone this was science. The real cure often came down to luck, surviving long enough for your body to heal itself before the doctor killed you. Next time you complain about modern healthcare, remember. At least they don't treat pneumonia by strapping a dead pigeon to your feet. Medieval medicine was mostly theater, expensive, dangerous theater where the audience sometimes died. The few who recovered did so by simple chance, while physicians took credit for miracles they didn't understand. Going anywhere in the Middle Ages wasn't just inconvenient, it was an ordeal that could kill you. Roads weren't paved pathways but muddy tracks that turned to swamps in rain. Roman roads still existed in places, but centuries of neglect left them crumbling. What passed for roads were often just dirt ruts worn by cart wheels, deep enough to snap an ankle if you misstepped. In winter, they froze into jagged ice sheets. In summer, dust choked travelers while sun baked the mud into hard ridges that jolted carts apart. Bandits waited everywhere. Forests hid thieves who'd slit your throat for a wool cloak. Isolated stretches of road were perfect for ambushes. Travelers carried weapons, but so did the robbers, often better ones. Merchant caravans hired guards, but even they couldn't stop every attack. Pilgrim accounts tell of bodies left unburied by roadsides, stripped naked by thieves. Some bandits were desperate peasants, others were knights, between employments. Either way, they didn't ask nicely before taking your money. Inns were barely better than sleeping outside. Floors were dirt. Beds held fleas and previous guests' lice. Straw mattresses crawled with bugs that bit all night. If you were lucky, the innkeeper didn't water down the ale too much. If you weren't, he'd charge you extra for protection from the very thieves he probably knew. Some inns were just barns where you paid to sleep next to cows for warmth. Travelers warned each other about which places had rats in the food or beds that collapsed under you. Bridges were death traps. Wooden planks rotted unseen until they cracked under your horse's weight. Toll collectors charged outrageous fees to cross, claiming it was for maintenance, though the bridge never improved. Some bridges had missing sections where floods had washed parts away. You either paid a boatman to ferry you across, another robbery, or risked fording the river on foot, hoping the current wouldn't sweep you downstream. Weather decided whether you lived or died. Summer storms turned roads to sludge that sucked boots off feet. Winter snows buried paths entirely, leaving travelers to freeze in drifts. Spring floods washed out bridges. Autumn rains made hillsides collapse. Pilgrims wrote of watching companions drown in sudden downpours or vanish into bogs when mist obscured safe paths. There were no weather forecasts, you set out and hoped. Animals were as dangerous as the terrain. Horses threw shoes on rocky paths, leaving them lame. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion pulling overloaded carts. Dogs at villages attacked strangers. Even livestock could be deadly, startled sheep stampeded travelers off cliffs in the Alps. Wolves stalked isolated roads at dusk. The only thing worse than traveling alone was traveling with animals that might bolt or die on you. Navigation was guesswork. Maps were rare and inaccurate when they existed. Most travelers asked directions from locals who'd never been more than 10 miles from home. Road markers, when present, were often carved with symbols no one understood anymore. Stars guided some at night, but cloud cover left you wandering in circles. Many died taking shortcuts that led into trackless forests or swamps. Food spoiled fast. Hardtack bread was edible until it molded or weevils hatched inside. Cheese sweated in packs, attracting flies. Meat, if you had any, rotted within days unless heavily salted, then it was too tough to chew without soaking. Finding fresh water was risky, streams near villages were often polluted. Dysentery killed more travelers than bandits. You ate when you could, not when you were hungry. Pilgrims had it worst. They walked hundreds of miles in thin sandals, sleeping in ditches when inns were full. Their robes marked them as easy targets for thieves. Many never reached their destinations, dying of exposure or disease along the way. Those who made it often arrived skeletal, feet bleeding through worn soles. Some shrines displayed the shoes of pilgrims who'd walked themselves to death. Merchants faced different problems. Carts broke axles on rough roads. Valuable goods attracted thieves. Toll collectors invented new fees at every border. Porters demanded higher wages halfway through trips. Horses ate through grain supplies faster than planned. A single washed-out bridge could force days of detours, ruining delivery schedules. Many merchants preferred risking sea travel's storms to land travel's endless hassles. Speed wasn't an option. Even royal messengers averaged only 30 miles a day on fresh horses. Ordinary travelers made 10 to 15 miles if the road was good. Bad weather cut that in half. Carts moved slower, maybe 8 miles a day before needing repairs. Walking was steadier but exhausting. No one hurried, they just endured. Most people never traveled far. 20 miles was a lifetime's radius for peasants. They knew their local market town but rarely saw the nearest city. News took weeks to spread. Strangers stood out instantly in villages. Marriages happened between neighboring families because no one met anyone farther off. The world was small, and travel kept it that way. Distance warped time. A letter from London to Rome took 2 months if it arrived at all. Military orders reached armies after battles were over. Kings made decisions based on months-old information. Isolated villages might not hear of a new monarch's coronation until the next tax collector arrived. The farther news traveled, the less it mattered when it finally came. Rivers were the only reliable routes, when they flowed the right way. Boats moved faster than carts but couldn't go upstream without being towed by teams of men or animals. Rapids sank overloaded barges. Low water stranded vessels for weeks. Toll castles along banks demanded payment from every passing ship. Still, merchants preferred rivers, at least the road couldn't suddenly disappear underwater. The miracle wasn't that travel was hard. It was that anyone tried at all. Every journey was a gamble with hunger, thieves, and broken bones. Yet people kept walking those terrible roads, for faith, for trade, or just to see what lay over the next hill. They knew the risks. They went anyway. That's more courage than most of us need for a trip to the grocery store. Medieval marriages weren't about love letters or courtship. They were business deals written in legal contracts. A typical marriage agreement spent more words listing property than describing the couple. Dowries decided matches, land, livestock, or cash changed hands before vows did. One surviving contract from 14th century France specifies exactly how many sheep the bride's family owed, down to the last lamb. Romance didn't enter into it. Parents arranged marriages while children were still in cradles. Noble families traded infants like chess pieces. A 3-year-old girl might be promised to a 7-year-old boy to secure a border between estates. The Italian Visconti family married a 12-year-old daughter to a 50-year-old warlord because he controlled a strategic fortress. Wedding nights often got delayed until the bride reached puberty, but the deal was sealed long before. Dowries made or broke marriages. A peasant girl's family might scrape together a cow and some blankets. Nobles traded entire villages. One English knight refused to marry until his bride's father included a watermill in the deal. Brides who couldn't pay often became nuns instead. Records from Champagne show whole convents filled with noblewomen whose families couldn't afford husbands for them. Weddings themselves were dry affairs. The church required consent, but that didn't mean enthusiasm. A priest would ask the bride if she agreed, while her father stood behind her coughing meaningfully. Some brides whispered yes through gritted teeth. One German chronicle describes a noblewoman vomiting from nerves during her vows. Everyone pretended not to notice. Married life was often distant. Nobles maintained separate households for tax reasons. Merchants spent years traveling between fairs. Peasant couples worked opposite ends of fields from dawn till dusk. A Florentine ledger from 1392 shows a husband and wife noting down conversations. They only spoke twice in 6 months, both times about rent payments. Infidelity was common but punished unevenly. A cheating wife could be beaten or locked up. A cheating husband might get fined, if anyone bothered to press charges. Church courts heard constant cases of adultery, but the wealthy usually paid their way out. One bishop reduced a nobleman's penance after he donated a new stained glass window. Annulments happened more than you'd think. Couples cited consanguinity, being distantly related, to escape bad matches. One clever wife got an annulment by proving her husband was her 17th cousin, a technicality everyone ignored until he started beating her. Impotence claims required humiliating inspections. A French court ordered a reluctant groom to demonstrate his abilities before witnesses. He failed, and the wedding was cancelled. The church's rules created loopholes. You couldn't marry your 7th cousin, but the wealthy bribed priests to forget relations. Some nobles married secretly at night, then denied it come morning. One English heiress married 3 men this way before the king stepped in. The Pope made a fortune selling dispensations to bend marital laws. Divorce didn't exist, but separations did. Couples could get bed and board splits, no remarrying, but no more sharing a home. A London merchant's diary celebrates his separation by noting, "Now I can eat hot food again," implying his wife burned everything. Separations required proving cruelty or abandonment. One woman brought neighbors to testify about her husband throwing chamber pots at her head. Widows had more power than wives. Inheriting a dead husband's estate gave women rare independence. Some refused remarriage to keep control. A Burgundian widow ran her own vineyard for 20 years, turning down 6 proposals. Others remarried quickly for protection. One English will shows a woman leaving everything to her second husband, cutting out her own children, for he hath been kind. Courtly love flourished precisely because marriages were so cold. Knights wrote poems to married noblewomen they'd never touch. This wasn't cheating, it was theater. A lord might admire another man's wife publicly while privately negotiating his daughter's marriage to that same man's son. Romance lived in ballads, not bedrooms. Peasants had slightly more say in partners. With less property at stake, families sometimes let children choose. Village festivals allowed flirting under watchful eyes. But even here, practicality won. A farmhand's proposal often began, "Your father's field borders mine." Wedding gifts were tools, not trinkets. A new plow or iron pot meant more than flowers. Marriages ended how they began, with paperwork. Wills show couples leaving each other the bare minimum required by law. One Yorkshireman left his wife 1 stool, 1 cup, and no more. Funerals were the only time some spouses publicly showed affection. A Venetian widower's epitaph reads, "She complained less than most," which passed for high praise. The church's ideal, lifelong monogamy, rarely matched reality. Priests themselves kept mistresses despite the rules. A bishop's account book lists payments to a woman discreetly referred to as the housekeeper. Ordinary couples found their own compromises. Diaries mention special friends and good neighbors who filled emotional gaps. Marriage wasn't about happiness. It was survival. 2 people became one economic unit, plowing fields, running shops, paying taxes. A French proverb put it plainly, "Better a solid roof than a tender kiss." Next harvest or next raid, that roof would still be standing. The kiss would be long forgotten. Let me know in the comments whether you'd rather face an arranged marriage or join a convent. And dim the lights. Next we're covering why violence stalked every medieval street. You couldn't walk down a medieval street without planning for violence. Every trip to market, every visit to the next village, carried the real risk of attack. People carried weapons the way we carry phones, always within reach. A knife in your belt, a club by the door, a spear leaning against the wall. This wasn't paranoia. Parish records list countless deaths from tavern brawls, roadside ambushes, and nighttime break-ins. Self-defense wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Laws in many regions required households to keep weapons. English statutes ordered every man between 15 and 60 to own arms according to his wealth. A rich man needed a helmet and chainmail. A poor man got by with a knife and a stout stick. Failure to arm yourself could mean fines. The message was clear, your safety is your problem. Watchmen existed but were unreliable. Towns hired a few men to patrol after curfew, but they were often drunk or in on the crime. London's night watch was famous for sleeping through robberies. Wealthy households hired private guards. Everyone else took turns standing watch or trusted barking dogs to warn of intruders. City gates closed at dark, but walls were easy to climb where guards weren't looking. Court rolls overflow with violent cases. A typical entry might read, John smote Thomas with an axe for insulting his wife. Fines were common, but only if they caught the culprit. Most attackers vanished into the countryside. Victims who fought back rarely faced punishment unless they killed someone important. One Yorkshire record praises a baker who beheaded a robber with his bread paddle. Domestic violence was routine and barely punished. Husbands could beat wives as long as they didn't use weapons or cause permanent injury. A French law specified clubs couldn't be thicker than a man's thumb, the infamous rule of thumb. Women who fought back risked harsher penalties. One German town ordered a woman's hand cut off for stabbing her abusive husband. Children learned violence early. Boys trained with wooden swords by age 6. Peasant youths brawled at festivals while nobles jousted. Apprenticeship contracts expected masters to discipline boys with rods and fists. Schools taught Latin verbs alongside wrestling moves. Surviving medieval toys include tiny swords and wooden shields. Play fighting was preparation for a world where you might need real fighting skills. Night was the most dangerous time. Without streetlights, darkness hid footpads and cutthroats. Travelers who couldn't reach an inn by dusk slept in trees to avoid wolves and bandits. Even home wasn't safe, thieves broke through thatched roofs or loosened door hinges. Wealthy families slept with servants armed with cudgels at their bedroom doors. Alcohol fueled most violence. Taverns were battle zones where dice games turned bloody. A spilled drink could start a knife fight. Many towns banned weapons in alehouses, but everyone carried them anyway. Drinking vessels were made of metal or hardwood because pottery cups kept breaking in brawls. Some innkeepers kept buckets of sand to soak up blood. Women weren't exempt from violence. Noblewomen trained to use daggers for self-defense. Peasant women wielded distaffs, spinning tools, as clubs. One English court case describes a fishwife who caved in a thief's skull with a salted cod. Widows running businesses always kept weapons near their market stalls. The justice system added to the chaos. Trials were quick and punishments brutal. A pickpocket might lose a hand while a murderer could walk free if he claimed self-defense. Local lords settled disputes based on who paid more. Victims often took revenge themselves rather than trust corrupt courts. Feuds between families could last generations. Weddings and festivals often ended in riots. Alcohol mixed with ancient grudges turned celebrations into battlegrounds. One Swiss record describes a wedding where guests brought crossbows and killed 3 people. May Day dances frequently became mass brawls. Tournaments intended to channel violence sometimes devolved into real fights with actual casualties. Even religion turned violent. Pilgrims got robbed by fellow travelers. Church almsboxes needed iron straps to prevent theft. Fights broke out over prime seating during Massachusetts. Religious processions sometimes turned into mob attacks against minority groups. The same people who kissed relics on Sunday might stab a neighbor on Monday. Weapons were everywhere. Peasants hid sickles in their cloaks. Butchers carried cleavers. Farmers had pitchforks. Cobblers used awls as daggers. Wealthy men wore swords as fashion accessories. Traveling merchants slept with hatchets under their pillows. You didn't need formal training, everyone knew basic moves from watching fights. The constant threat shaped behavior. People traveled in groups. Doors had multiple locks. Business deals happened in daylight with witnesses. Children weren't sent on errands after dark. Visitors were searched before entering homes. Unlike modern crime stats, medieval violence wasn't concentrated in bad neighborhoods, danger lurked everywhere, all the time. You adapted or didn't survive. The Middle Ages didn't have police forces or self-defense laws. Your safety depended on your willingness to hurt someone else first. That's why medieval artwork shows even saints carrying weapons. Protection was holy. Let me know in the comments what you'd carry for self-defense, a dagger, a club, or maybe just very fast-running shoes. The idea that you could work your way up in medieval society is mostly fantasy. Forget rags to riches, if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. The system was designed that way. Primogeniture made sure of it. The eldest son got everything, the land, the title, the power. Younger sons might get a sword and some advice about finding a war to fight in. Daughters were bargaining chips for marriage alliances. Your last name mattered more than your skills. Nobility wasn't a job you could apply for. You were born into it, or you weren't. A lord's son became a lord. A blacksmith's son became a blacksmith. Records show entire villages where families did the same work for 10 generations. Last names like Baker, Cooper, or Fletcher weren't just labels, they were life sentences. The few exceptions prove the rule. One English peasant named William Marshall became a knight through pure military talent, then spent his life being treated as an outsider by nobles who resented his rise. The church offered one of the few escape routes. A clever peasant boy might become a priest if he could read Latin. But bishop positions usually went to noblemen's younger sons. Monasteries weren't much better, abbots came from wealthy families who donated land. One chronicle mentions a low-born monk who rose to lead his order, but his peers constantly mocked him as the plowman's son. Even holiness couldn't erase birth status. Marriage was another slim chance, mostly for women. A merchant's daughter might marry a minor noble if her dowry was fat enough. But these weren't love matches, they were property mergers. Contracts specified exactly how much money would change hands. One Italian bride's family paid extra because their bloodline wasn't pure enough. The groom's family wanted compensation for the social stain. Towns pretended to offer opportunities. A successful merchant could buy fancy clothes, but he still couldn't sit with knights at feast. Guilds controlled trade so tightly that becoming a master craftsman required marrying a master's widow or being born into the right family. Apprenticeship fees were so high that most trainees were guild members' nephews. London records show guilds charging outsiders triple fees to keep competition down. The legal system enforced the status quo. Serfs needed their lord's permission to leave the manor. Peasants who ran to cities could be dragged back if caught within a year. Sumptuary laws dictated what clothes you could wear based on birth. No peasant could sport velvet or fur, no matter how rich they got. One wealthy butcher was fined for wearing silk hose above his station. Nobility went to absurd lengths to protect their exclusivity. Spanish kings created volumes tracking bloodlines to prove who had pure Christian ancestry. French nobles demanded genealogies going back centuries before approving marriages. German knights formed exclusive tournaments where entrants had to prove 4 noble grandparents. This wasn't just snobbery, it was protecting the monopoly on power. War sometimes created accidental mobility. A lucky foot soldier might be knighted on the battlefield, then spend the rest of his life begging for land to match his new title. More often, mercenaries died poor despite their service. One English archer at Agincourt was granted a pension, 3 pence a day, barely enough for beer. His descendants remained cottagers. The Black Death briefly shook things up. With half of Europe dead, workers could demand higher wages, until nobles passed laws capping pay. Rebellions like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt tried to force change but failed. The revolt's leaders were hunted down and hanged while wearing symbols of their ambition. One had a fake crown nailed to his head. Art tried to justify the system. Church paintings showed peasants happily toiling while angels crowned nobles. Morality plays warned about the dangers of ambition. One popular story featured a farmer's son who tried to become a knight. He ended up trampled by his own horse. The message was clear: stay in your lane. Records hint at quiet rebellions. Peasants gave children names like Freeman or Liberty. Families hid better marriages in their past. A few invented noble ancestors. One clever baker claimed his great-grandmother was a duke's illegitimate daughter. None of it worked. Tax rolls still listed them as common. Even death maintained the divide. Nobles were buried inside churches with stone effigies. Merchants got markers in the churchyard. Peasants went into unmarked pits. Archaeologists can still tell social class from skeletal remains. Aristocrats had less arthritis from labor but more lead poisoning from fancy pewter plates. The few who slipped through cracks faced constant suspicion. A merchant turned landowner would be called new money for generations. A knight risen from poverty was always that upstart. Social climbers were tolerated only when useful, like when kings needed tax collectors dumb enough to anger both nobles and peasants. Wealth didn't equal status. A rich merchant might rival a baron's income but couldn't judge court cases or lead troops. One London trader bought a manor only to find locals still took disputes to the penniless heir of the old family. His money couldn't buy what centuries of bloodlines had established. Parents reinforced the system. Peasant kids learned early not to dream beyond the pasture. Noble children practiced looking down on others before they could ride. Even the church taught that social orders were God's plan. Rebelling meant risking your soul. The modern idea that anyone can reinvent themselves would baffle medieval people. To them, your birth was your destiny, like being born tall or short. Some things just couldn't be changed. Let me know in the comments if you think you could have handled living with those limits. And dim the lights. Next time we'll look at how medieval technology wasn't quite as backward as you think. We picture the Middle Ages as technologically barren, but that's not quite true. They had innovations, just painfully slow ones. Forget Silicon Valley startups. Medieval tech moved at the speed of a crippled ox dragging a plow through mud. The problem wasn't stupidity. It was a world where ideas took generations to spread, and every improvement fought against centuries of, "That's how we've always done it." Watermills were medieval engineering marvels, when they worked. A good mill could grind grain, saw wood, and even forge iron. But building one required rare expertise. Millwrights guarded their knowledge like treasure. One 12th century English village waited 30 years to get their mill repaired because the only competent craftsman died before teaching apprentices. Even when mills spread, lords often monopolized them, charging peasants to use their water power. Farming tools show how tiny upgrades mattered. The heavy plow took centuries to spread across Europe. It worked better in northern soils but required 8 oxen to pull, something only wealthy villages could afford. Crop rotation caught on slowly too. 3-field systems yielded more food, but convincing peasants to change traditions was hard. One French monk wrote in frustration about farmers who cling to their fathers' foolish ways though hunger gnaws their children. Gothic cathedrals prove medieval builders weren't primitive. Flying buttresses and ribbed vaults were revolutionary, yet each advancement took lifetimes. Chartres Cathedral burned 3 times during construction because no one had figured out proper scaffolding. Architects experimented through trial and error, often fatal. Records show workers falling when new techniques failed. And since each cathedral took generations, knowledge died with builders. No YouTube tutorials to preserve their skills. Metalworking advanced in fits and starts. Damascus steel blades were legendary, but the technique vanished when the Artisans' Guild dissolved. Armor improved from chainmail to plate, yet flaws persisted. A 14th century knight complained his new breastplate rusted shut after one rainstorm. The smith had skimped on oiling the hinges. Blacksmiths rarely shared secrets, so good techniques remained local until some apprentice finally traveled. The printing press transformed Europe, but took decades to matter. Early books were expensive curiosities. It took 20 years before printers realized margins and paragraphs made books easier to read. Even then, most towns couldn't afford presses. A single Bible cost a clerk's yearly wages. Knowledge spread slower than we imagine. Some monasteries still copied books by hand a century after Gutenberg. Military tech was equally sluggish. The longbow won battles but took generations to adopt. It required years of training, so nations stuck with crossbows. Cannons appeared in the 1300s, but were so unreliable that siege engines remained common into the 1500s. Armies mixed old and new, knights in plate armor fighting beside gunpowder units, because no one trusted unfamiliar weapons. Shipbuilding improved through disasters. Cogs evolved to carry more cargo, but each design change risked sinking. Hanseatic League records list ships lost when experimental rigging snapped. Sailors resisted innovations. One captain refused to use a compass, insisting he could smell land. Navigation remained guesswork for centuries. Portolan charts were rare and often copied with errors that wrecked whole fleets. Medicine barely progressed. Doctors still followed Galen's ancient texts centuries later. Surgeons occasionally discovered something useful, like realizing wine cleaned wounds, but never shared findings widely. A barber surgeon in Paris might know stitches, while his London counterpart still cauterized wounds with boiling oil. Without standard training, each practitioner reinvented the wheel. Clocks were status symbols more than tools. Early mechanical clocks lost hours daily. Monasteries kept using water clocks because they were cheaper and more reliable. When spring-driven clocks appeared, only kings could afford them. Town clocks often broke down. One German village's records show the clockkeeper was attacked twice for letting people miss mass. The problem wasn't intelligence, it was systems. Guilds restricted trade knowledge. Roads were too poor for experts to travel. Peasants couldn't risk failed experiments when starvation loomed. Wars destroyed workshops and libraries. A clever inventor in Toulouse might never meet his counterpart in Ghent to compare notes. Some technologies regressed. Roman concrete recipes were forgotten, leaving medieval builders with weaker mortar. Hypocaust heating vanished, making castles perpetually cold. Parts of Europe lost even basic literacy after Rome fell. Knowledge flickered like candles in drafty halls, constantly in danger of going out. Yet when necessity pressed, innovation happened. Windmills dotted Holland's coasts once farmers ran out of rivers to dam. Double-entry bookkeeping emerged to track complex medieval trade. Spectacles appeared once glassmakers realized their lenses could help aging scribes. These weren't flashes of genius, just slow adaptations to real problems. The Middle Ages didn't lack clever people. They lacked ways to preserve and spread ideas. An invention might help one village for generations before reaching another 50 miles away, if it ever did. Living in constant danger changed how medieval people thought. Imagine never feeling safe, plagues could strike, bandits might attack, your child could die from a scraped knee. This wasn't occasional stress. It was the background noise of existence. People developed coping mechanisms that would seem strange today, but made sense when tomorrow wasn't promised. Alcohol was the most common escape. Peasants drank weak ale daily because water wasn't safe, but they also drank to forget. Taverns stayed packed even during famines because a drunk man didn't feel hunger pains. Monks brewed strong beers for sustenance, but records show some consuming gallons a week. One priest's diary mentions blessing barrels first thing each morning, then drinking from them last thing at night. Religion offered another outlet, but not the kind we'd recognize. People didn't just pray, they bargained. Votive candles at shrines weren't lit for piety, but as down payments on miracles. Cure my cough, and I'll donate a chicken. Saints became spiritual customer service reps. One woman left her shoes at a shrine with a note, "Saint Anne, make my husband stop beating me, and I'll walk home barefoot." When prayers failed, some turned to magic, burying eggs inscribed with curses or nailing dead owls to barn doors. Violence simmered just below the surface. Town records list fights over nothing, a spilled drink, a bumped shoulder. Chroniclers describe men weeping while sharpening knives, then stabbing neighbors in sudden rages. The constant stress of hunger and danger shortened tempers. One court case involves a baker who killed a customer for complaining about bread weight. The judge ruled it justified because the customer spoke harshly during Lent. Sleep brought little relief. People feared nighttime because darkness hid threats. Many suffered from night terrors, what we'd call PTSD nightmares. A medieval doctor's journal describes patients waking screaming about the dead crawling into bed. Some slept with weapons. Others took poppy-derived drugs, waking more exhausted than when they lay down. The wealthy drank sleeping cups of wine laced with herbs. The poor just endured. Children absorbed this anxiety early. Parents taught kids to fear everything: woods, wolves, strangers, bandits, even beautiful women, witches. Lullabies warned of monsters instead of promising sweet dreams. One surviving cradle song translates to "Sleep fast, baby dear," or "The plague doctor's near." Kids played games simulating hangings and funerals. Toys included miniature coffins. This wasn't cruelty, just preparing them for reality. The church capitalized on fear. Hell wasn't some abstract concept, preachers described it in stomach-turning detail. Doom paintings showed sinners eaten alive by demons. One Easter play featured a character vomiting snakes to represent guilt. People left money in wills for sin-eaters. Paupers who'd consume bread placed on corpses, supposedly absorbing the dead person's misdeeds. Salvation felt impossible, but damnation seemed guaranteed. Some coping methods were creative. Towns held mad parades, where people dressed as monsters and shrieked through streets. Historians think this was group therapy, acting out fears to tame them. Feast of Fools celebrations let peasants mock nobles without punishment. Laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. One chronicle describes a village hit by plague where survivors told jokes over graves, to spite death himself. Others turned inward. Mystics starved themselves into visions. Flagellants whipped their own backs raw, believing pain purified. One woman's diary describes carving crosses into her arms, to feel something besides dread. These weren't rare extremists, they were logical responses to unbearable stress. When the world's horrors overwhelm, some always seek control through self-destruction. The wealthy suffered differently. Lords obsessed over legacy since they couldn't control present chaos. They commissioned elaborate tombs years before dying. Family crests appeared on everything, dishes, bed curtains, even underwear. One knightsville demanded his horse be buried upright so all would remember my stature. Status symbols became psychological armor against meaninglessness. Art reveals the mental toll. Look past the religious scenes in medieval paintings, notice the faces in crowds. Many were blank stares we'd associate with shell shock. Marginal doodles in manuscripts show monsters eating people alive. Even cheerful tapestries often hide disturbing details, a smiling farmer might have a noose subtly woven into the background. Most people developed a grim fatalism. Proverbs from the time say things like, eat, drink, for tomorrow we rot. Gallows humor flourished. One gravestone reads, I told you I was sick. People expected the worst because the worst usually came. Optimism wasn't naivety, it was recklessness. Modern psychology would diagnose half the Middle Ages with depression and anxiety disorders. But these weren't illnesses to them, just normal responses to their world. When death lurks around every corner, paranoia keeps you alive. When hunger gnaws your gut, numbness helps you function. They weren't weak, they adapted to horrors we can barely imagine. Let me know in the comments how you think you'd cope, with drink, prayer, or maybe just screaming into the nearest well. And dim the lights. Next we're covering why so many medieval things we believe are completely wrong. We think we know the Middle Ages, but most of what we've learned is wrong. Hollywood and Victorian storytellers gave us knights in shining armor and grand castle feasts, none of which were common. The truth is, these romantic visions tell us more about what later generations wanted to believe than what actually happened. The noble knight is the biggest fantasy. Real knights were more like medieval gangsters than romantic heroes. Their armor rusted in the rain and stank of old sweat. Many were illiterate thugs who burned villages for money. The code of chivalry? Mostly propaganda. Records show knights breaking every rule. One French knight's diary brags about pillaging a church because the gold was too tempting. Castles weren't luxurious palaces. They were damp, rat-infested fortresses designed for war, not comfort. Archaeologists find insect remains in castle bedding and human waste in courtyard corners. Even kings dealt with fleas in their beds. Those towering stone walls. Meant to keep enemies out, not to impress guests. A typical castle smelled like a mix of wet dog and rotting meat. Medieval food myths are equally off. Lavish feasts happened maybe once a year for nobles. Peasants ate the same pottage, a thin grain stew, nearly every day. Famines were common. When crops failed, people ate bark or starved. The medieval diet wasn't some healthy organic fantasy, it was whatever kept you alive until the next harvest. Medicine wasn't just bad, it made things worse. Doctors used leeches because ancient Greek texts said to, not because they worked. Surgeons operated drunk because they had no anesthesia. The Black Death saw physicians wearing beak masks stuffed with herbs while telling people not to bathe. More patients died from treatments than diseases. Social mobility barely existed. If you were born a peasant, you died one. The few who rose did so through extreme luck, like William Marshall, a peasant son who became a knight but spent his life mocked as the plowman's boy. Guilds blocked outsiders from trades. Towns passed laws keeping peasants in their place. One statute fined rich farmers for wearing silk above their station. Childhood didn't exist as we know it. Kids worked adult jobs by age 6. Noble children were married off for political deals before puberty. Toys were miniature tools, small plows for farmers' sons, tiny spindles for weavers' daughters. Parents expected half their children to die young, so emotional attachment was different. One mother's diary describes her son's death as God's will, so now we have one less mouth. The church wasn't holy, it was corrupt. Bishops lived like kings while preaching poverty. Priests sold forgiveness for cash. One 15th century cardinal had 9 illegitimate kids he then gave church jobs to. People knew but stayed quiet, complaining risked excommunication. Some villages hid pagan rituals because at least those didn't cost money. Warfare wasn't glorious battles, it was mostly starving in muddy camps. Knights spent more time fixing rusted armor than fighting. Most soldiers died from dysentery, not swords. Sieges meant sitting outside castle walls for months, eating moldy grain while defenders threw rotting carcasses at you. The few battles were short, brutal massacres, not the hours-long duels movies show. Life expectancy wasn't just low, it shaped everything. At 35, you were old. Diseases we shrug off today killed people in days. People made wills young because later might not come. One merchant's diary says he renewed his will every winter, in case the cough takes me. This wasn't pessimism, just experience. So why do these myths persist? Because the truth is uncomfortable. We prefer knights in shining armor to the reality of flea-bitten mercenaries. Castles seem romantic until you learn about the stench. The Middle Ages weren't a fairy tale, they were a hard, short struggle where most people just tried to survive another year. Our modern myths say more about us than medieval people. We project our fantasies onto the past because the reality is too grim. But history isn't about what we wish happened, it's about what did. The next time you see a movie with clean, happy medieval villagers, remember, they probably smelled like a dumpster and were one bad harvest from eating their shoes. Let me know in the comments which myth surprised you most, the dirty castles, the thuggish knights, or maybe the fact that medieval people weren't all that different from us, just dealing with a much harder world. And dim the lights, next we're covering why even our darkest ideas about the Middle Ages might still be too kind. So that's the medieval world, no knights in shining armor, just rust and fleas. No grand feasts, mostly moldy bread and hunger. People lived short, hard lives where a scraped knee could kill you and your landlord could beat you legally. But they survived. That's what matters. They endured plagues, wars, and rotting teeth because they had no choice. Makes our bad days seem pretty small, doesn't it? Before you go, hit like if you learned something unsettling. Let me know which hardship would have broken you first, the smells, the violence, or maybe just the daily grind. And remember, history isn't about judging. It's about understanding how people lived through hell so we don't have to.